Blood thicker than water. Not in the Harrington family. Cut off from a billion-dollar empire, a rejected son was thrown into the street with absolutely nothing but a rusted iron key. What he eventually unlocked didn't just expose a devastating family lie, it rewrote his entire destiny. Rain violently battered the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Harrington Consolidated Holdings skyscraper in downtown Manhattan. Inside the sprawling mahogany-paneled corner office, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. Arthur Harrington stood perfectly still, his jaw clenched, staring across the vast expanse of a custom glass desk at his father. Richard Harrington, a billionaire real estate tycoon with a reputation for merciless acquisitions, did not look at his son with an ounce of paternal warmth. Instead, his eyes held the cold, calculating glare of a predator assessing a failed investment. "You had one job," Arthur Richards' voice sliced through the quiet room, low and venomous. "Sign the zoning waivers. Turn a blind eye to the environmental reports for the Hudson Project. It is how business is done. It is how this family built a legacy." "It's fraud, Dad," Arthur replied, his voice trembling but resolute. "You're poisoning the groundwater of an entire community to save 3% on construction costs. I won't put my name on it." Richard leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. "Conscience is a luxury for the poor, Arthur. I raised an heir, but it seems I ended up with a liability." Without breaking eye contact, Richard pressed a button on his intercom. "Security, please come up to the penthouse. Arthur is leaving us. Permanently." Panic flared in Arthur's chest. "What are you doing?" "I am cutting out the rot," Richard stated matter-of-factly. "As of this moment, your trust fund is dissolved. Your corporate credit cards are cancelled. The locks on your penthouse have already been changed. You are no longer a Harrington in anything but name." Before Arthur could process the sheer magnitude of the betrayal, Richard pulled a small, battered wooden box from his desk drawer and tossed it carelessly across the glass surface. It slid and stopped just inches from Arthur's hands. "Your grandfather Thomas was a sentimental old fool," Richard sneered. "Before he died, he insisted you have this. He said you'd need it when you inevitably fell from grace. Take your trash and get out." Arthur slowly reached for the box. The wood was splintering the hinges, heavily oxidized. He opened it. Inside, resting on a bed of decaying velvet, was a single heavy iron key. It was entirely encased in a thick layer of orange-brown rust, its teeth worn, its bow plain and unremarkable. It looked like a piece of scrap metal salvaged from a shipwreck. The heavy doors of the office swung open, and two burly security guards stepped in. Arthur looked from the rusty key to his father's impassive face. He didn't plead. He didn't yell. He simply closed the box, slipped it into his coat pocket, and walked out of the life he had known for 26 years. The transition from a billionaire's heir to an outcast was brutal and unforgiving. By sunset, Arthur found himself standing on a damp sidewalk in Queens, with only the clothes on his back, his driver's license, and $42 in cash. His phone had been deactivated. His friends, all beneficiaries of his father's inner circle, suddenly stopped answering his calls. Over the next 3 years, Arthur's existence became a grueling masterclass in survival. He rented a shoebox-sized windowless room above a loud laundromat in Astoria. He worked exhausting, back-breaking shifts, unloading freight trucks at a Brooklyn dockyard. The tailored suits were replaced by grease-stained denim. The fine dining was swapped for instant ramen and cheap coffee. The physical toll was immense, but the psychological burden was infinitely heavier. Every ache in his muscles was a reminder of his father's cruelty and his own spectacular fall from grace. Through it all, the rusty key remained with him. He didn't know why he kept it. Most nights it sat on his scratched laminate nightstand, mocking him. a rusty, useless piece of iron from a grandfather he barely remembered, handed to him by a father who despised him. Sometimes, in the darkest hours of the morning, when the despair threatened to swallow him whole, Arthur would stare at the key and feel a surge of bitter resentment. Why hadn't Thomas left him money or watch, something he could pawn to pay the heating bill? Instead, he was left with a mystery he had neither the time nor the energy to solve. Yet deep down, a quiet, stubborn voice whispered to him. Grandfather Thomas Harrington had been a legendary figure, a self-made man who built the foundation of the family empire with nothing but grit and cunning. He wasn't a man who did things by accident. If Thomas had specifically requested Arthur receive this key, it had to mean something. But as the years dragged on, the rust on the key seemed to mirror the rust growing over Arthur's own spirit. He was forgotten, disowned, left to rot. The turning point arrived on a bitterly cold Tuesday in November. Arthur had just returned from a 14-hour shift in the freezing rain to find an eviction notice pinned to his door. His landlord was raising the rent, and Arthur was already 2 months behind. He slumped onto his thin mattress, utterly defeated. He looked at the rusty key on the nightstand. In a sudden, blinding flash of anger, Arthur grabbed the heavy iron object and hurled it across the room. It struck the radiator with a loud metallic clang and bounced onto the worn floorboards. Arthur put his face in his hands, waiting for the anger to subside. When he finally looked up, his eyes caught a glimmer of something strange near the radiator. He walked over and knelt down. The impact had chipped away a significant chunk of the thick, century-old rust near the bow of the key. Beneath the corrosive crust, a sliver of unblemished, gleaming metal caught the dim light of the overhead bulb. It wasn't iron underneath. It was an alloy, silver bright and meticulously polished. His heart skipping a beat, Arthur scrambled to his tiny kitchenette. He grabbed a bottle of cheap white vinegar, some baking soda, and a wire bristle brush he used for cleaning his work boots. Returning to the floor, he began to furiously scrub the key. For hours he worked meticulously, applying the acidic mixture and brushing away decades of neglect. His fingers bled, but he couldn't stop. Slowly, the true nature of the artifact was revealed. The key was a masterpiece of early 20th century metallurgy, intricately grooved, heavy, and undeniably bespoke. But it was what he found engraved along the shaft that made the breath catch in his throat. Tiny, precise letters barely visible to the naked eye spelled out a cryptic message: A.B. Depp, Vault 714, Pen. Arthur stared at the engraving until his vision blurred. A BDP. He immediately grabbed his outdated second-hand laptop and began searching. The internet was a vast ocean, and at first his queries yielded nothing but modern banking acronyms and dead ends. He spent 3 sleepless nights diving into digital archives, historical society forums, and digitized newspaper clippings from the 1800s. Finally, on a deeply obscure historical blog dedicated to the Gilded Age, he struck gold. A BDEP stood for the Astor Bancroft Depository, a highly secretive subterranean private vault system established in 1893. It was built exclusively for the titans of industry, the oil barons, the railroad tycoons, the men who owned America. It was a place to store things that couldn't be trusted to standard banks. Items of immense value, illegal contracts, blackmail material, undocumented gold. According to the blog, the main facility was located in Pennsylvania. Penn, hidden entirely off the grid beneath a seemingly abandoned textile mill in a remote town called Blackwood, a town called Oakhaven, nestled deep in the Allegheny Mountains. The depository supposedly closed its doors in 1929 after the stock market crash, its vaults sealed and forgotten by time. Arthur's pulse pounded in his ears. Grandfather Thomas had been a young, ruthless businessman in the 1920s. Could he have secured a vault there? And if so, what did he leave inside Vault 714, driven by a desperate, burning curiosity and the undeniable reality that he had absolutely nothing left to lose? Arthur pawned his laptop, his heavy winter coat, and his emergency stash of canned food to buy a one-way bus ticket to Pennsylvania. The journey was a grueling 12-hour ride through endless sheets of grey rain. When Arthur finally arrived in Oakhaven, he found a town that time had largely forgotten. It was a dying coal and lumber community, shrouded in fog and surrounded by dense, imposing forests. Using an old printed map he had downloaded at the public library, Arthur trekked 3 miles out of town into the woods. His boots sank into the freezing mud. The cold bit through his thin sweater, but the heavy polished key in his pocket felt like a burning coal urging him forward. Eventually the trees broke, revealing the towering skeletal remains of a massive brick textile mill. The roof had caved in decades ago, and ivy choked the crumbling masonry. It looked like a haunted monument to a bygone era. Arthur slipped through a gap in the rusted perimeter fence and approached the structure. The blog had mentioned that the entrance to the depository wasn't in the mill itself, but beneath the old supervisor's estate house behind it. Arthur found the stone foundation of the house mostly reclaimed by the earth. He searched frantically for an hour, pushing aside rotten wood and debris. Just as he was about to give up his boot, struck something solid and metallic beneath a layer of wet leaves. He fell to his knees and dug with his bare hands, uncovering a heavy iron trapdoor flush with the stone floor. It was secured by a massive modern padlock. Someone had been here recently, or at least someone was keeping people out. Arthur grabbed a heavy piece of loose masonry and brought it down on the padlock with all the strength his dock worker muscles could muster. Smash, smash, smash! On the 4th strike, the cheap metal shackle gave way. He heaved the heavy iron door open. A rush of stale, cold air wafted up from the darkness, carrying the scent of dry dust and old paper. Peering down, he saw a narrow spiral staircase made of wrought iron, descending into the black abyss. Arthur clicked on his cheap flashlight. The beam cut through the gloom, revealing damp stone walls. He climbed down his footsteps, echoing ominously in the suffocating silence. At the bottom of the stairs, he found himself in a massive, vaulted chamber constructed of solid granite. It was an engineering marvel hidden away from the world. The walls were lined top to bottom with hundreds of reinforced steel safety deposit boxes. The metal was tarnished, covered in a thick layer of dust, but largely untouched by the dampness outside. Arthur's flashlight beam danced across the numbers etched into the steel doors. 105, 340, 512. He walked down the cavernous aisle, his breath pluming in the freezing air. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. 680, 701, 714. Arthur stopped. The beam of light illuminated a medium-sized square door at chest height. Vault 714. His hands shook violently as he reached into his pocket and pulled out the polished key. He stared at it for a second, a lifetime of rejection, poverty, and betrayal flashing through his mind. His father's mocking laughter, the cold nights in Astoria, the endless hunger. He stepped forward, guided the key into the intricate circular keyhole, and pushed it in. It slid perfectly into place. Arthur took a deep breath, gripped the bow of the key, and turned. There was a moment of heavy resistance, followed by a loud echoing clack as the internal tumblers dormant for nearly a century finally gave way. Arthur pulled the heavy steel handle. The door groaned in protest, metal grinding against metal, and slowly swung open. Arthur shined his flashlight into the dark cavity of the vault. It wasn't filled with gold bars. It wasn't stuffed with stacks of $100 bills. Resting in the center of the vault was a large, meticulously preserved leather briefcase. Beside it sat a single sealed envelope addressed to him in his grandfather's elegant, sprawling handwriting to Arthur. For when the truth is required. Arthur reached in his fingers, trembling, and broke the wax seal on the envelope. He unfolded the brittle parchment and began to read. As his eyes scanned the words, the blood drained entirely from his face. The rusted key hadn't just unlocked a forgotten vault in a dead town. It had unlocked a secret so massive, so dangerous, that it was about to bring the entire Harrington empire crashing down in flames. Would you like to know what was inside the briefcase, and how Arthur used it to enact his revenge? Let me know, and I'll tell you the rest of the story. Arthur's eyes scanned the fragile, yellowed paper. Thomas Harrington's handwriting was jagged and urgent. My dearest Arthur, if you are reading this, it means Richard has finally shown his true colors, and the failsafe I established has been activated. The empire you believe your father built is a house of cards constructed entirely on stolen blood and buried sins. Arthur's breath hitched in the freezing subterranean air. He read on the letter, detailing a history so vile it made his stomach churn. The core of Harrington Consolidated Holdings. The initial massive capital injection that propelled them into real estate dominance in the 1980s did not come from Thomas's legitimate business acumen. It came from a man named Jonathan Caldwell. Caldwell was a brilliant urban developer and Thomas's silent partner. Together, they had secured the rights to a revolutionary, eco-friendly zoning grid that would have changed modern architecture. But Richard Young, and ruthlessly ambitious, saw Caldwell's moral compass as a financial bottleneck. The letter detailed how Richard secretly orchestrated a horrific smear campaign, framing Caldwell for massive embezzlement and racketeering. But Richard didn't stop there. When Caldwell threatened to go to the authorities with proof of Richard's sabotage, Caldwell tragically died in a highly suspicious, unsolved automobile accident on a winding New England road. I was a coward, Arthur. The letter continued, the ink blotchy, as if the old man had wept while writing. I knew what Richard did. I found the forged documents. I found the payment receipts to the men who tampered with Caldwell's brakes. But Richard was my son. I buried the truth to protect the family name, and in doing so, I surrendered my soul. I watched your father transform into a monster, building a billionaire's throne on Jonathan's grave, but I could not let him have absolute power forever. Arthur reached into the pristine leather briefcase with trembling fingers. Inside lay meticulously bound ledgers, original bank transfer receipts, and a terrifyingly detailed diary kept by Thomas, documenting every illegal bribe, every extortion plot, and every environmental cover-up Richard had executed over 3 decades. It was a perfectly preserved arsenal of corporate annihilation. Yet it was the heavy velvet pouch at the bottom of the briefcase that truly shifted the earth beneath Arthur's feet. He opened it to find a stack of antique ornate documents. They were bearer bonds and irrevocable voting trust certificates. Your father thinks he owns the company, the final paragraph of the letter read. He does not. He holds voting proxies that I legally tethered to the physical possession of these very certificates. The 51% majority share of Harrington Consolidated Holdings was never transferred to Richard's name. It was placed into a blind trust, waiting for the one person I believed possessed the integrity to tear the rot down you. Whoever holds these papers holds the empire. Arthur was no longer a disowned, impoverished dock worker. He was the majority shareholder of a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate. He was his father's master. A sudden, sharp sound shattered the silence of the vault. Crunch. It was the distinct noise of a heavy combat boot snapping a fallen branch. The sound drifted down from the iron spiral staircase. Arthur killed his flashlight instantly, plunging the vault into absolute darkness. He held his breath, his heart hammering against his ribs like a captive bird. "Check the sub-level," a gruff, echoing voice commanded from above. The proximity sensors on the perimeter fence were tripped. "Mister, Harrington wants this property secured. If there's a squatter, break their legs and toss them out." Arthur's blood ran cold. His father hadn't entirely forgotten about Oakhaven. He had placed it under remote surveillance. 2 beams of high-powered tactical flashlights began to sweep down the spiral iron steps. Arthur possessed only seconds. He silently shoved the bearer bonds, the ledgers, and the letter back into the leather briefcase. He latched it shut. There was no secondary exit. He was trapped in a stone tomb with men who would not hesitate to kill him and bury the evidence. Desperation bred a reckless strategy. As the first security contractor reached the stone floor, sweeping his blinding light toward the aisles of deposit boxes, Arthur gripped his heavy steel flashlight. He didn't hide. He stepped out from behind the heavy steel door of Vault 714, rearing his arm back, and hurled the heavy metal cylinder with every ounce of his strength. It connected violently with the contractor's jaw. The man grunted and collapsed, his tactical light clattering across the granite floor. "Hey!" the second guard shouted, rushing down the final steps, pulling a heavy baton from his belt. Arthur didn't hesitate. He clutched the briefcase to his chest and lunged forward, tackling the second guard around the midsection. They crashed onto the unforgiving stone stairs. Arthur's shoulder screamed in agony. But the years of back-breaking manual labor at the Brooklyn docks had given him a dense, brutal strength the polished security guard wasn't expecting. Arthur drove his elbow into the man's ribs, scrambled over his groaning body, and bolted up the spiral staircase. He burst through the iron trapdoor into the freezing, pouring rain, sprinting blindly into the dense Allegheny forest. Branches whipped his face, and mud dragged at his boots, but he didn't stop running until his lungs burned with the taste of copper, and the haunted ruins of Oakhaven were miles behind him. He had survived, and he had the weapon he needed. 3 weeks later, the atmosphere inside the glass and steel boardroom of Harrington Consolidated Holdings was electric with anticipated triumph. High above the Manhattan skyline, 30 of the most powerful shareholders, board members, and legal advisors sat around a massive, polished mahogany table. At the head of the table stood Richard Harrington. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit, projecting the aura of a man who commanded the very tides of the global market. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard announced, his voice smooth and commanding. "Today marks the final phase of the Hudson Basin acquisition. This merger will not only solidify our absolute monopoly on commercial waterfront development, but will increase our quarterly dividends by an unprecedented 42%. A murmur of greedy approval rippled through the room. "All that is required," Richard continued, gesturing to the towering stack of legal contracts before him, "is the formal board ratification." "I'm afraid, Richard, that those contracts are legally worthless," a clear, ringing voice interrupted. The heavy frosted glass doors of the boardroom swung open. The room fell into a stunned, breathless silence as Arthur Harrington walked in. He was unrecognizable from the ragged, desperate man thrown onto the street 3 years prior. Arthur wore a perfectly tailored navy blue suit. His posture was rigid, his gaze icy and unyielding. Trailing closely beside him was Beatrice Montgomery, one of the most feared and brilliant corporate litigators in the country. Arthur had cashed in one of the smaller, untethered antique bonds to retain her firm. Richard's face flushed with a sudden, violent rage. He slammed his hands onto the table. "Security. How did this vagrant get into the building? Remove him immediately." 2 security personnel stationed inside the room stepped forward, but Beatrice Montgomery raised a single manicured hand. If you lay a finger on my client, you will be facing federal assault charges alongside the massive corporate fraud investigation that the SEC is opening as we speak," Beatrice stated calmly, her voice echoing off the glass walls. Richard scoffed, though a flicker of unease flashed in his eyes. "You are bluffing, Arthur. You have nothing. You are nothing." Arthur walked slowly toward the head of the table. He did not break eye contact with his father. He placed the weathered vintage leather briefcase onto the pristine mahogany surface. The contrast was stark. The click of the brass latches echoed like gunshots in the quiet room. Arthur withdrew the velvet pouch and pulled out the ornate, heavily stamped bearer bonds. He slid them across the table. "Grandfather Thomas never transferred the majority shares to you, Dad," Arthur said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "He put them in a blind trust tied to these physical certificates. You have been operating this company as a proxy whose tenure has just been permanently terminated." The board members gasped. The company's lead counsel snatched the documents, adjusting his glasses frantically. After an agonizing minute of scrutiny, the lawyer looked up, his face entirely pale. "Richard," the counsel whispered, his voice trembling. These are authentic. They bear the original corporate seal and Thomas's notarized signature. Arthur holds 51% of the voting power. He has total control." "That is impossible," Richard roared, lunging for the papers. "They are forgeries. He is a liar and a thief." "The only thief in this room is you," Arthur countered, pulling the ledgers and the diary from the briefcase. He turned to the board. "What you are looking at is 30 years of documented corporate espionage, environmental sabotage, and the premeditated framing and murder of Jonathan Caldwell, the true architect of this company's early success." The silence in the boardroom was absolute. The air grew thick, suffocating. "My legal team has already submitted these documents along with audio transcripts and payment records found in the vault to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the EPA, and the District Attorney's Office," Beatrice added smoothly. "Warrants for your arrest, Mr. Harrington, are currently being signed by a federal judge." Richard stepped back, his chest heaving, his immaculate facade crumbling into dust. He looked around the room, seeking allies, but the board members were already physically backing away from him, terrified of being caught in the blast radius of his impending destruction. "You ungrateful wretch!" Richard hissed, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper as he glared at Arthur. "I gave you a life of luxury. I gave you everything, and you destroy your own blood." "You didn't give me anything," Arthur replied, his voice devoid of anger, replaced only by a profound, chilling resolve. "You threw me to the wolves. But you forgot one thing, Dad. You left me with a key, and the wolves taught me how to bite." The wail of police sirens began to rise from the city streets below, a faint, rhythmic sound that slowly grew louder, piercing the insulated glass of the penthouse. Arthur gathered the bonds, meticulously placed them back into the leather briefcase, and snapped it shut. He looked at the empty chair at the head of the table, his father's chair. "The Hudson Basin acquisition is officially cancelled," Arthur declared to the stunned, silent room. "Furthermore, a $1 billion restitution fund is being established immediately for the Caldwell family and the communities we have polluted. We have a lot of work to do to clean up the rot." Arthur walked over to the head of the table. He didn't sit down immediately. He looked at the heavy, rusted iron key he had placed beside the briefcase. It was no longer a symbol of his rejection, but the very instrument of his resurrection. As federal agents stormed into the boardroom, slapping handcuffs onto the wrists of a broken, screaming Richard Harrington, Arthur picked up the key and slipped it into his pocket. The storm had finally broken. The Harrington Empire had fallen, only to be rebuilt by the son who was left with nothing but rust and iron. If this story of betrayal, hidden secrets, and ultimate redemption kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button. Right now, don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on our thrilling real-life dramas. Have you ever discovered a shocking family secret? Tell us about it in the comments below and share this video with a friend who loves a mind-blowing plot twist.